the ruler of a great empire on the run. He has lost everything, his privileges, his army, his treasures. But he's still king of the country stretching endlessly before him, Persia. His last battle was a nightmare, a terrible nightmare. Alexander the Great had swept all before him. And he can still see the most awful thing as if it happened yesterday. His world going up in flames. Persia, 2,500 years ago, an empire of desert and rock, yet the center of the world. The caravans came from every direction, their destination Persepolis, heart of an empire spanning thousands of kilometers, from the Indus to the Mediterranean, from the Libyan desert to the steppes of Central Asia. The Persian Empire was 10 times the size of modern Germany. In Persepolis, King Darius held sway. He sat on a throne of gold. A king who saw all and knew all. An infallible ruler.
Das Persische Reich ist ein Vielvölkerstaat. Und in vielen Punkten kann man sagen, ist das Persische Reich Vorgänger und Vorbild für das Imperium Romanum.
The whole known world paid tribute to this empire. Ancient images tell the story. They came by sea in ships from Greece, from Egypt. From distant India, they brought treasure by the cartload. Elephants, camels, and oxen carried their country's treasures on their backs. All with a single goal: to glorify the rule of the greatest king of all time. At this time, the desert became a treasure house, a flowering garden. And the sophistication of the king's palace, gleaming in all the colors of the rainbow, brought together all the know-how of the ancient world. Persepolis was regarded as the 8th wonder of the world. As new computer modeling demonstrates, it was an architectural masterpiece. Persepolis was built on an artificial terrace 125,000 meters square that rose up to 18 meters above the plain. It was a palace the size of a city. In the center was the throne hall, the largest interior space of its time. Craftsmen from all over the world worked on it for 4 generations. A ruler's dream made stone. Today, only ruins remain. There's not much for the tutelary gods on the palace portal to watch over. The exquisite lotus flowers on the mighty columns are among the few reminders that this palace was created for eternity. Looking down, the symbol of the city's former might, the bull of Persepolis. Monumental terraced outdoor staircases bordered by finely engraved stone reliefs, all work of unequaled craftsmen. Gigantic columns, 20 meters high, at that time an unbelievable height. Palace gates that seem to have been built for titans, fascinating figures that tell of a long-lost world.
Persepolis war unter den Residenzen des Großkönigs die herausragende. Sie stellt eine Verbindung dar von Palastanlage und administrativem Zentrum. Immer dort, wo sich der König aufhielt, war auch das Zentrum des Reiches.
But in spite of the empire's size and strength, it had an adversary that would seal its doom. Persia's nemesis was a small empire, 100 times smaller than Persia. Macedon. In Pella, capital of this empire, a child was born who would change everything. He was born here in the shadow of the mountains, Alexander, later called the Great. It was he who would challenge the mighty King Darius. His teacher was Aristotle, the ancient world's leading philosopher. From him, the little prince learned to think logically, the power of words, and the fundamentals of politics. Alexander turned his teacher's words into deeds, and he never forgot what Aristotle told him of Persia's immeasurable wealth. Gold abounds like sand in the treasure houses of Persepolis. Gold that should be taken to avenge what the Persians once did. 150 years before, the Persians had destroyed the Acropolis in Athens. The destruction of the pride of Greece was a punishment for the Greeks refusing to submit to the Persian yoke.
Die Perserkönige haben den griechischen Städten in ihrem Machtbereich Frieden garantiert und Wohlstand garantiert. Aber sie haben ihnen die politische Selbstständigkeit genommen, vor allem das Recht, Krieg zu führen auf eigene Rechnung. Das sind Dinge, die die Griechen selber in ihrem Selbstbewusstsein gekränkt haben. Sie wollten frei sein.
Alexander felt called to make this dream of freedom come true. Early on, he learned how to win. He didn't have much time. He would die young. But in his short life, he achieved more than any other commander before him.
Alexander besaß eine ungewöhnliche Energie, war in der Lage, selbstgesteckte Ziele unter größten Schwierigkeiten zu verwirklichen und war darüber hinaus jemand, der durch ein unglaubliches Charisma herausstach. Sonst wäre es ihm nicht möglich gewesen, so viele Leute anzuziehen, die ihm auch bedingungslos gefolgt sind.
Alexander was 20 when he inherited the crown. Now nothing could stop him. Destiny was calling. He was convinced the gods were with him. In 334 BC, he began an astonishing venture. With 30,000 men, he invaded Persian territory. His goal, to conquer the whole world. Alexander's men would change the world forever and redraw the geopolitical map. At Troy, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia. Although young, Alexander was a brilliant strategist. First, he wanted to occupy the ports of Asia Minor so that the powerful Persian fleet could not use them to attack his homeland. Issus, an important Persian port city, has long been a mystery. Its location was forgotten for 2,000 years. Only recently, an international team led by an American, Marie Henriette Gates, pinpointed the site of the city. Professor Gates is certain this is the place where Alexander and Darius met for the first time. On this spot, the collapse of Persian power began.
was thus certainly the site of Issos, large enough with its harbor to house the fleet of Cyrus the Great before his naval invasion of Greece.
A paradox of history. Researchers are sure it was from Issus that the Persian fleet sailed to conquer Athens 2,500 years ago. A victory that ultimately gave Alexander the desire to retaliate. Is there any trace of what was once the pride of the Persians? Does the mud hide any relics of that huge, invincible fleet? The divers discover shards of oil jars, part of the supplies on a Persian warship. Two and a half thousand years ago, the ship must have been moored with this heavy stone anchor. The place where Darius's army fought a bloody battle against Alexander is now a loading station for liquid petroleum gas from the Caspian Sea. This is what happened on the beach near Issus in the year 333 BC. Darius is lining up his heavy cavalry to charge Alexander's lines. The Pilorus River still separates the warring armies. Alexander reacts at once. He lines up his cavalry on the south bank and blocks the Persian infantry with his dreaded phalanx units. On his right, at the edge of the mountains, he suddenly throws in his elite cavalry. Taken completely by surprise, the Persians retreat. Alexander can now attack the great king directly. In the National Museum of Naples, there is a mosaic over 2,000 years old, Alexander at the Battle of Issus. Like a snapshot taken by a combat photographer, it shows the precise dramatic second when Darius lost his nerve. The Persian battle line is chaotic, a confusion of fleeing and dying soldiers. Facing them, a young, decisive Alexander. Darius has given up.
Wir haben in der Antike immer wieder den Fall, dass die Person des Feldherrn letzten Endes die wichtigste Waffe eines Heeres ist. Das Heer ist das Werkzeug des Feldherrn. Und in dem Augenblick, wo der Feldherr versagt, dann nützt die ganze Tapferkeit der Soldaten nichts mehr.
The Persian king is using his scythed chariot to flee. Was Darius a coward? Does the mosaic tell the historical truth, or does it distort it? Was the 22-year-old Alexander really so superior? The Pilorus River, 3 kilometers from the sea. Professor Gates has solved the historical puzzle. On this very spot, Darius first confronted the military genius of Alexander.
According to ancient sources and geomorphological reconstruction of the landscape 2,300 years ago, this is where the cavalry of Alexander charged down the slope on the south bank of the river, forded the river, and caught Darius and his army by surprise.
In spring 333 BC, this river ran red with the blood of thousands, so the chronicles report.
Darius war durchaus nicht weltfremd. Er konnte nur nicht ahnen, dass er es mit einem solchen Gegner zu tun hatte, der mit einer derartigen Energie und Entschlossenheit den Sieg wollte. Alexanders Militärstrategie war sensationell. Sein Wille zum Sieg größer als das seines Kontrahenten. Der Einsatz der Kavallerie bahnbrechend.
It was in the bloody confusion of ancient battle in man-to-man combat that Alexander's special talent emerged. He was fighting a numerically superior army that was said to be invincible. Speed was his secret weapon. Speed and psychology.
Wir haben viele Beispiele, in der ein zahlenmäßig unterlegener Gegner, der geschickt taktiert, einen größeren Gegner vernichten kann, zerschlagen kann. Und das hat Alexander eigentlich in all den Schlachten, die uns bekannt sind, immer wieder bewiesen. Denn er wusste, rein zahlenmäßig hat er keine Chance. Er konnte es eigentlich nur durch die psychologische Kampfführung schaffen. Und das hat er gepackt.
The result, Darius vacated the field. The great king fled, and not for the last time.
Taktik Alexanders war es, die Person des Großkönigs im Zentrum seiner Truppen direkt zu bedrängen. Diese Vorgehensweise war mutig und erfolgreich. Doch es hätte alles auch ganz anders kommen können. Alexander riskierte mit dieser Taktik, selbst getötet zu werden.
Alexander would stake everything on a single card, and now he seemed very close to victory. He enjoyed the fruits of his triumph, the glorious treasures that Darius left behind in his camp. This, it seems, is royalty. He is said to have remarked of the treasures Darius left behind. A hint of the whole wealth of Persia, golden bowls, an abundance of jewelry, the heavy drinking horn. The world of the Persian kings seemed made of gold. There for the taking. And he acquired another treasure, Statira, the wife of Darius. The ancient historians write that he greeted her with respect and treated her honorably. Alexander, a gentleman. Alexander was a new type of ruler, but he was full of contradictions. Ancient frescoes glorify him as a handsome hero. On ancient coins, he's even revered as a god. But what about the real Alexander, the man behind all these images? Did Alexander adopt the megalomania of the Persian rulers? His court did adopt the customs of the great king's court. For centuries, the courts of the Persian kings had been dominated by obsequious ceremonies, laid down to the last detail and recorded in the reliefs. This was an unbearable obligation for the freedom-loving Greeks. Did Darius, the hated enemy, become Alexander's secret role model?
Je tiefer Alexander in das Perserreich eintrat, desto mehr veränderte sich sein Charakter und sein Auftreten. Alexander verlangte die fußfällige Verehrung von seiner Umgebung, die Proskinese, also auch von seinen Makedonen. Dies stieß gerade bei den Makedonen auf großen Widerstand. Nicht deswegen, weil man damit einen Gott verehrte, sondern weil sie darin die Huldigung eines fremden orientalischen Herrschers erblickten.
Alexander made himself into a god and forgot what his teacher Aristotle taught him, moderation and justice. There were reports of excesses in his camp, of orgies, drunkenness, and violence.
An Alexander haben sich zu allen Zeiten die Geister geschieden. Haben die einen in ihm den Wegbereiter der kulturellen Verbindung zwischen Ost und West gesehen, so haben die anderen an die Brutalität seiner Maßnahmen während des Feldzuges gegen Persien erinnert. Von seinen Strafgerichten hat er nicht einmal Unschuldige, Frauen und Kinder ausgenommen. Tausende wurden in die Sklaverei verkauft oder sogar getötet.
Nevertheless, Issus was a triumph, but it was still a long way from Persepolis. The Persian army was not yet finally beaten. There were thousands of kilometers to go through enemy territory. But Persepolis beckoned like an irresistible promise. The ruins of Persepolis make its former splendor hard to imagine. From the monotonous brown roundabout, This monument to power rose up gleaming like a brightly colored precious stone. Those colors have long been faded by wind and weather. In the Glyptothek in Munich, Dr. Vinzenz Brinkmann is tracking down the lost splendor of the ancient world's colors. The beam from the special lamp illuminates more than the white marble. In the ultraviolet spectrum, what has been invisible to the naked eye for thousands of years is now revealed. The once rich colors of the painted sculptures. Although modern taste favors white marble statues, the ancient world loved bright colors. The ultraviolet light gives a hint of what a Persian warrior's colorful scale armor was like. The computer combines data from innumerable studies into a full image. This is what the archer from the army of great King Darius originally looked like, realistic and brightly colored. The secret of the colors shows how close the relationship between the Greeks and Persians was, even long before Alexander's time.
Ganz offensichtlich haben griechische Künstler selbst in Persepolis gearbeitet, haben dort nicht nur ihr Wissen vermittelt an die persischen Kollegen, sondern auch selbst Hand angelegt. Es sind auch was den Stil und die Ausführung, also die Manier, die Handarbeit anbelangt, haben wir inzwischen so deutliche Parallelen, dass wir das mit Sicherheit annehmen können.
The palace where Darius lived is like a symbol of the political system in modern Persia, now called Iran. It is like a representation of the multinational state with a variety of talents and skills, emerging of all possible cultures. And at the heart of all the splendor, the throne of the king, a guarantee that this multicultural state will not fall apart. This archival footage illustrates the enduring influence of Persepolis. This is how the Shah of Iran celebrated the state jubilee over 30 years ago. Everything intended to give modern Iran its identity came from Persia 2,500 years ago. The soldiers in historical dress bearing weapons that once made Persia strong. The war chariots, the high tech of the ancient world, which outclassed every other weapon system. The ancient tradition of the legendary great kings was very much to the fore, but it didn't bring the modern tyrant any greater luck. The Shah, too, was toppled, like his predecessor, Darius. Pomp and splendor disappeared overnight. Darius and Alexander, an unlike pair. Yet their longings were the same. Alexander, too, dreamt of unlimited power. His battlefield would be the whole world.
Alexander glaubte an seine Sendung, an die Herkunft von Herakles und von Jupiter und sah nun das Perserreich vor sich. Und jemand, der so viele Erfolge im Leben hatte, der hört in der Regel auch nicht auf. Es gibt ganz wenige große Eroberer, die irgendwann gesagt haben, so, jetzt reicht's.
How strong was the resistance to Alexander's ambitious plans? This question fascinated the archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld. In 1933, his team made a sensational discovery at Persepolis. They uncovered thousands of cuneiform texts on clay tablets, the archives of the ancient Persian Empire. These documents reveal what life in ancient Persia was like, not just at court, but also the everyday life of the people. The great kings created an outstanding infrastructure. Traders and travelers followed established, secure routes, and a network of caravanserais was a guarantee of trade in the multinational state.
Es gibt ein zentrales, herrschendes Volk, das aber viele kulturelle Einflüsse von außen akzeptiert, übernimmt, sehr lernfähig ist, außerordentlich tolerant und von daher hat das Perserreich ja in der Tat lange Jahrhunderte hinweg diesen gesamten Nahen Osten als Imperium Persicum beherrschen können.
The most obvious proof of the Persians' cultural sophistication is about 100 kilometers from Persepolis. Pasargadae, the old capital of the empire. Its palace was magnificent. Now, only a few columns remain. Researchers from the University of Lyon are trying to reconstruct a picture of the city as it was. Using thousands of aerial photographs, they have examined the whole area to the centimeter and have revealed what was invisible to the naked eye. Hidden structures in the ground. These structures contain the secret of Pasargadae, a gigantic irrigation system that sustained the dusty wasteland.
Dans l'héritage achéménide, il faut aussi parler des jardins que l'on appelle en persan, enfin, qui a donné le mot paradis, et ce sont des jardins extrêmement bien aménagés, très symétriques, parfaitement irrigués, et on a à Pasargade le plus ancien exemple de ce type de jardin.
The water that made Pasargadae a fertile garden came from the melted ice and snow of the Zagros Mountains a few hundred kilometers away. The great kings knew how to use this rich resource. And water was the most valuable treasure of this desert world. Water that transformed the brown wasteland into a colorful garden, the elixir of life. Only a few ruins are left, like this stone pool, part of the gigantic plumbing system in the palace precinct.
On parle souvent de la décadence de l'Empire achéménide. Il faut savoir que l'archéologie ne rend absolument pas compte d'une décadence, bien au contraire. On peut penser qu'il y a un certain nombre de techniques qui ont été ou créées ou améliorées à l'époque achéménide, se sont maintenues à travers l'Antiquité, le Moyen-Âge et jusqu'à l'époque moderne.
Fountains are an everyday sight in modern cities. Most are purely decorative. But the people of ancient times used this technology to conquer the desert. Through great canals, or qanats, like this one, the life-giving water flowed through the desert into the capital. Some of the water pipes survive after more than 2,500 years. They are masterpieces of ancient hydraulic engineering. Underground rivers that shielded the precious water from the sun and conducted it safely to the heart of the empire. In the city of Yazd, you can admire the last example of this irrigation technology. A city in the middle of the desert, like Persepolis, but blooming and alive. 300,000 people live here.
Die alten Kulturen sind natürlich durch die Bewässerung reich, Bewässerung muss organisiert sein. Bewässerung wird auch organisiert, zentral organisiert. Und von daher sind diese Zentren des ökonomisch-landwirtschaftlichen Reichtums immer auch frühe Zentren der politischen Organisation gewesen. Man kann sagen, dass ohne Alexander das Persische Reich sicher noch Jahrhunderte hätte dauern können, gar keine Frage.
The people of the Persian Empire, the ancestors of today's residents, were content. They benefited from the advantages of a centralized administration that removed the boundaries between peoples. Liberalization of trade, a common currency, and unified weights and measures promoted solid economic growth. The faces of the people in this town still seem to reflect the ancient pride in the achievement of their ancestors, who created a paradise in the desert. What mysterious energy drove Alexander on? Did he feel chosen by fate to rule the world? And Darius? What weapons did he have left, apart from his rage, his failure to grasp that a little David was challenging the mighty Goliath?
Er hat wohl Angst gehabt. Ich vermute, dass er ganz klare Minderwertigkeitsgefühle gegenüber diesem Mann gehabt hat. Also Alexander hat sich auf den schwächsten Punkt konzentriert und das war Darius.
Darius's strength was also his greatest weakness. It was the legacy of his great ancestors that paralyzed him. Carved in stone, this proclamation claims that only the Persian king is destined by God to rule the world. Darius's ancestors came from country like this, country that breeds toughness, that must be forced to yield a meager living. They can be found here today, the tribal fathers of the culture, nomads who can still wield their ancient weapons and whose way of life is still the same as it was 2,500 years ago. Their songs tell of a hard life between the mountains and the steppe, of restless wandering, always following the pasture, a merciless life, a fight against oneself and others. Man and beast alike must defer to nature. They must accept the unchanging nature of the conditions and derive all their strength from doing so. Go barefoot over snow-covered mountain passes. Darius was a child of this world, hard, pitiless, born to win. That is what the legacy of his ancestors demanded. And now, he gathered the largest force his empire had ever seen. 150,000 men. He was using everything he had. Was this his final chance? Darius could sense that it was. He would take up the challenge. But as yesterday's loser, where would he get the mental strength to turn the tables? From the stars? In the Astronomical Calculations Institute in Heidelberg, scientists are studying a list of cosmic events from the time of King Darius. They could provide clues about unusual heavenly phenomena that possibly changed the course of history. Dr. Lutz Schmadl is programming an event that must have occurred over Mesopotamia shortly before 8 p.m. on the 20th of September, 331 BC. An eclipse of the moon.
Die Finsternis war also sichtbar über dem ganzen Indischen Ozean, von der Küste aus Afrikas bis Zentralasien, bis nach Hinterindien. Muss sich also an ein bemerkenswertes Ereignis gehandelt haben. Die Finsternis hat dann schließlich geendet mit dem Austritt des Mondes aus dem Kernschatten der Erde gegen 23 Uhr Ortszeit.
What impression must this sign from the heavens have made on Darius and his soldiers? Was it seen as a good or a bad omen? Did superstition have a decisive influence on the course and outcome of the Battle of Gav Gamala? Historians are certain that Darius was a follower of the ancient religion of the preacher Zoroaster. Fire is the symbol of the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda. The religion has survived to the present day. In Darius's time, the flames blazed in old cult sites in a universe full of secrets. Persian ritual prescribed that the dead be offered to the heavenly afterlife on these towers of silence. There, the corpses were left out for the vultures, mediator beings who would consume the earthly body and carry it to heaven. Thus, the signs of the firmament, whether good or bad, would certainly have had a strong influence on people in ancient Persia. But something quite different probably decided the war. A superior weapon. The sarissa. With a blade forged